In the previous videos, we talked about healing brushes, the clone stamp tool, liquify filter, content-aware techniques, and the dodge and burn tools. So now it's time to put them all together in one combined workflow. So we will retouch this portrait. And apart from repeating the same techniques, here you can learn what's the best combination or order of doing all these techniques when you use them together. And let's start with liquify. This is the part which I call the plastic surgery bit, where we can make amends to features, which is probably not always necessary. And even in this case, I don't want to seem unethical or anything like that. I wouldn't make any difference on her picture because she looks beautiful. There's no need to make any changes. But sometimes when you have to work on images, your art director or creative director might tell you to make certain amends to images. So as a user of Photoshop or a retoucher, you would have to know how to do these things. Now to use liquify non-destructively, we know that we need to turn this layer into a smart filter first of all, and then we can go into filter menu and choose liquify. So that's the basic setup. And now we have the image in liquify mode. So I'm using a big brush with the forward warp tool, and then I'm going to click and drag these edges very gently around until I get a slightly more even and round shape for the jaw. Now we can push these points in as well slightly. And you will see once we get to the Photoshop Fix application, which is a free version of Photoshop on your mobile, you can do this even faster and easier in that. But because we are on the desktop version, I'm doing this with the liquify tool. So you can see that we can create a more even shape, and I will probably push that slightly in, and then the center bit we can push out a little bit more, just so we don't lose her jaw or chin. So I'm going to push this also slightly in like that. Now, of course, we could make further changes as well, but I think this was more than enough. So we can click on OK to accept these changes, and we can see before and after. Now, believe me, unfortunately, it's very common that images look completely different once they are retouched to the original ones. So never really believe what you see in magazines or adverts, even in films, because anything can be changed completely from the source material. I just demonstrate how easily these things can be done. I'm not necessarily saying this is a good thing. So let me zoom slightly closer, and then let me walk you through the next steps. Next stage, I normally retouch the hair and the skin, but I do that on a separate layer. We can't even do it on this layer because it's a smart object. So we have to create a separate layer, and that's why I'm going to call skin and hair. So here I'm going to use mainly the spot healing brush tool, set to sample all layers and using the content aware option. And because I'm using a pen tablet, I have the pen pressure set up, so it works with my brush strokes. The harder I press, the bigger the brush stroke gets automatically. And what I'm going to do is to paint over under her eyes. But you will see already that is going to remove too much detail, and it's not actually working well. So in these cases, it's best to switch to the other version of the healing brush, so the normal healing brush, because with that, I can sample on a certain detail. So again, this is set to all layers. I can sample and then paint over this part here. Okay, now you might think that that's a bit too much, but we can always reduce the opacity of this later on. I'm just going to go over these parts here as well. And we can also remove or reduce wrinkles a bit. Well, because she has a very lovely smile, you can decide to keep some of these wrinkles in. But if you go over it, as I'm doing it right now, as you can see, you can once again always reveal bits of it later if you want by reducing the opacity of this layer. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So instead of removing all these details, I just soften those details. And even with a reduced opacity, I can continue doing the same thing, going over some of the additional details where I decide to soften her skin a bit. So reduce a little bit of these wrinkles here as well. Maybe also on her nose, we can go over some details. Then we can also retouch the skin a bit. Some of these imperfections can be made a bit more subtle. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the skin, because this is something that professional retouchers would spend a lot of time on improving. But I am going to just focus on the most important details. As you can see, I'm alt-clicking to sample and then painting over on anything I feel like needs to be refined. And even her lips needs a bit of work here, especially. So I go over that part as well. And then we could also go over slightly there. Now if we check before and after, even from a distance, that should make a difference. So that was before and this is after. So that looks better. But now we can also continue doing the same thing with the hair. If we want to tidy up the hair, we could switch back to the spot healing brush tool. And actually going to do that on a separate layer. So I will rename this layer to be just skin. And on a separate layer, I'm going to address the hair. So with a smaller brush, I'm just going to paint over these flyaway hairs to remove them. There's obviously quite a lot on this side, so you don't actually have to go over all of them if you don't have the time for it. But if I were retouching this image, I would probably try to reduce it as much as possible. So I'm just showing you some of it, but you can imagine doing the same thing over and over until you remove most of these flyaway hairs. It's again something that you can decide is actually adding to the image, then keep them in, but most of the cases these should be tidied up. And even sometimes you will have to do the same thing here, so tidy up even inside, not just outside. And then whenever you feel like there is a bit of a smudge detail, just go over it a couple of times, maybe even use the clone stamp tool to improve those parts until you get to a good result. Okay, so you can imagine going through all of these one by one. You can really refine the hair until you get a good result. So I'm just going to finish off with this detail here and maybe just go over that part as well. So now if I turn on and off, you can see before and after. Now I'm not saying this is perfect, I would refine it further, but for now, just as an example, I wanted to point out that you can do this. And of course, I would do the same over her face. Like these parts, I would probably reduce a bit because it's going over her feature slightly and it's a little bit distracting. So we can always cut the hair back a bit on these parts until we are happy with the way it looks. And we don't have anything overlapping her chin, so I think that's fine. I'm just going to zoom out, see from a distance. So there's some changes on the hair, which from a distance is hardly visible, but these are subtle adjustments.